They called themselves the political soldiers of the Third Reich. They wore a different uniform from the Wehrmacht. They swore a different oath. Not to Germany, not to the Constitution, not to any abstract concept of nation or duty. They swore their oath directly to one man personally by name. And they meant it in a way that the professional soldiers of the regular army, with their older loyalties and their institutional traditions, never quite did. At its peak, the Waffen SS fielded 38 divisions and nearly 1,000,000 men. It fought on every major front of the Second World War. Its armored formations were among the most feared opponents that Allied and the Soviet commanders encountered. The Leibstandarte, the Das Reich, the Totenkopf, the Viking, these were not paper formations or garrison troops. They were combat organizations of genuine and documented tactical effectiveness, trained to a standard that exceeded the Wehrmacht's regular formations in intensity if not always in conventional military professionalism. And they were also an organization whose senior commanders were convicted of war crimes and the crimes against humanity at Nuremberg, whose members participated in massacres of prisoners of war and the civilian populations across Europe, whose institutional culture made the commission of atrocities not an aberration but a predictable consequence of the ideology that had selected, trained, and demotivated every member from the beginning. The Waffen SS is one of the most studied and the least understood military organizations of the modern era. Understood poorly not because the evidence is insufficient. There is abundant evidence. It is poorly understood because the evidence forces a conclusion that is genuinely uncomfortable. That military excellence and the criminal atrocity are not opposites that cancel each other out, that they can exist in the same institution, in the same division, sometimes in the same individual, simultaneously and without apparent contradiction in the minds of the people involved. This is that story. To understand what the Waffen SS was and how it came to be what it was, you have to begin with Heinrich Himmler and with a question that seems almost absurd given where it led. What is the ideal German man? It was a question that Himmler, a failed chicken farmer and the agricultural science graduate who had found his purpose in the Nazi movement in the mid-1920s, spent years trying to answer in the most literal and the institutional way possible. He believed, with the absolute conviction of someone who has found a total explanation for everything, that the German nation had degenerated from an original racial ideal, that the blood of the German people had been diluted and weakened by centuries of mixing with inferior racial types, and that what was needed was not merely a political movement but a biological program that would over time restore the original type. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, the Protection Squad, had begun as Hitler's personal bodyguard, a small elite unit distinguished from the SAS membership by stricter selection criteria and the absolute personal loyalty to Hitler. When Himmler took command of it in 1929, it had under 300 members. He turned it, over the following decade, into the institutional expression of his racial vision, a self-consciously elite organization whose members were selected not just for political loyalty but for physical characteristics that Himmler believed corresponded to the original Nordic type. Height requirements, dental examinations, genealogical research going back generations to certify racial purity. The selection process was, by any rational standard, pseudoscientific nonsense dressed in the language's biology, but it produced an organization whose members genuinely believed they were different from, and the superiority, the men of the regular army and the general population. The armed component of the SS, which eventually became the Waffen SS, grew from a series of distinct formations that were developed in the mid-1930s as the regime consolidated power. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Bodyguard Regiment, was established in 1933 as a ceremonial and security formation of roughly regiment strength. The SS Verfügungstrupp, the Special Purpose Troops, were established as a separate armed formation that would be available to Hitler for political purposes outside the chain of command of the regular army. The SS Totenkopfverbände, the Dutch head units, were established to guard the concentration camps, and the character and the institutional culture reflected the specific brutalization that came with the throw from the beginning. The Wehrmacht senior leadership hated the SS formations from the start, not primarily for moral reasons, though some of the professional officers were genuinely disgusted by what they saw of SS methods. They hated them for institutional reasons, for the competition for recruits in a manpower pool that the Wehrmacht considered its exclusive domain, for the special privileges and the direct access to Hitler that Himmler's formations enjoyed, and for the implication that the professional military establishment could not be fully trusted with the regime's security. The tension between the Wehrmacht and the SS was constant, structural, and never fully resolved during the entire duration of the Third Reich. The Spanish Civil War gave the SS formations their first taste of something approaching operational experience. The Winter War in Finland, observed rather than participated in, gave them a preview of what real combined arms warfare in adverse conditions looked like. But it was the fall of France in 1940 that gave the Waffen SS its first major operational test. And the results were mixed in ways that revealed both the formation's genuine qualities and the most dangerous characteristics simultaneously. In France, the SS formations fought with an aggressive intensity that the Wehrmacht commanders noted was exceptional even by the high standards of the campaign. The Leibstandarte and the Verfügungstrupp performed well in the breakthrough battles, and in the pursuit that followed the French collapse. But the campaign also produced the first of the systematic atrocities that would mark the Waffen's operational record throughout the war. At Wormhout in May 1940, soldiers of the Leibstandarte herded British and French prisoners of war into a barn and killed them with grenades and rifle fire. At Les Parades, soldiers of the SS Totenkopf Division under Fritzsche Klein executed nearly 100 British prisoners from the Royal Norfolk Regiment after they surrendered. Both massacres were documented. Both were investigated after the war. Klein was tried by a British military court in 1948 and hanged. The Wormhout perpetrators were never tried. The pattern established in France, of exceptional combat performance accompanied by the commission of war crimes against prisoners and civilians, would repeat itself across every theater where the Waffen SS operated. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 was the crucible in which the Waffen SS was transformed from a large and well-equipped police and security force with military pretensions into something that genuinely earned its reputation as a formidable combat organization. The scale, the ferocity, and the duration of the Eastern Front fighting demanded a level of military professionalism that the SS formations had to develop under fire because the pre-war training, however intensive in its physical demands, had not fully prepared them for the realities of sustained combined arms warfare against a determined enemy who learned quickly. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was redesignated as a division in the course of the Soviet campaign and was expanded progressively as the war continued. Its commander for most of its most significant combat operations was Josef Sepp Dietrich, a former butcher's apprentice and the First World War veteran who had been one of Hitler's earliest personal bodyguards and whose military qualifications were, by the standards of the professional officer corps, essentially non-existent when the war began. Dietrich was a soldier of genuine physical courage and considerable tactical instinct at the lower levels of command. He was less effective as an operational commander of large formations, a limitation that his division and the Lecter Corps and the army commanders sometimes compensated for and sometimes did not. His personal loyalty to Hitler was absolute and devoted. Hitler maintained a specific affection for Dietrich throughout the war that influenced operational decisions in ways that professional military logic would not have dictated. The performance of the Waffen SS at the operational level through 1941 and into 1942 was characterized by a willingness to attack and to maintain offensive pressure that made the formations valuable to Wehrmacht commanders, even those who personally despised everything the SS represented. In the desperate defensive fighting of the winter of 1941–1942, when the Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow drove German forces back from the closest approach to the capital and created crisis after crisis along the front, the SS formations were repeatedly used as fired brigades, committed to the most threatened points to stabilize situations that were threatening to collapse entirely. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, formed in 1942 from the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and the Totenkopf divisions, became the most powerful armored formation available to Army Group South and was committed to the most significant engagements of the 1942 and the 1943 campaigns. At Kharkov in February and March 1943, the Corps conducted what many military historians have assessed as the most impressive operational maneuver of the German armed forces in the second half of the war. After the Soviet winter offensive had retaken Kharkov and the German forces had been driven by in disorder across a wide front, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein executed a counteroffensive that used the SS Panzer Corps as its primary striking force, drawing the overextended Soviet formations forward, then cutting in behind them with armored thrusts that destroyed several Soviet tank corps and retook Kharkov in brutal street fighting. The tactical and the operational quality of the SS formations in the Kharkov counteroffensive was genuine. The coordination between armor and the infantry, the exploitation of Soviet overextension, the maintenance of offensive momentum despite enormous losses. These were the achievements of a military organization that had learned its trade in 2 years of the most demanding combat environment in the world. Wehrmacht commanders who evaluated the performance were not charitable about the SS in most contexts, but the Kharkov operation produced assessments that acknowledged the combat effectiveness of the formations without reservation. Kursk followed in July ke 1943, Operation Citadel. The German summer offensive aimed at eliminating the Soviet salient around Kursk was the largest armored offensive in the history of warfare. The SS Panzer Corps, now redesignated as the Kedua SS Panzer Corps, was the primary striking force of Army Group South's Northern Thrust, and its 4 days of fighting in the approach to Prokhorovka involved some of the most intense armored combat of the entire war. The Battle of Prokhorovka on July 12 TIS, 1943, when the Kedua SS Panzer Corps engaged the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army at close range in the wheat fields south of the town, has been written about extensively and its precise tactical outcome debated by historians for decades. What is not debated is that the Waffen SS formations fought with extraordinary intensity at Prokhorovka and in the surrounding engagements, taking and inflicting casualties at rates that demonstrated both the effectiveness of the training and the equipment, and the absolute willingness to absorb losses that the institutional culture Himmler had created made characteristic of every SS formation. The Totenkopf division alone, fighting on the eastern flank of the Corps advance, engaged in armored fighting of a sustained intensity that destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks while losing significant numbers of its own. Citadel failed. not because the Waffen SS failed. The southern Pincher's advance had made genuine progress that the northern Pincher, using Wehrmacht formations, had not matched. The operation was called off by Hitler after the Allied landings in Sicily created a crisis that demanded the transfer of SS formations to Italy. The decision to hold Citadel has been debated by German commanders ever since, with men arguing that the offensive had not yet exhausted its potential when it was stopped. The historical consensus is that even a continued offensive would not have achieved the decisive result the planners had intended, because the Soviets had prepared the Kursk defenses in depth that the German planners had not anticipated. After Kursk, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front shifted permanently to Soviet initiative. The Waffen SS formation spent the remainder of the war in an increasingly impossible strategic situation, committed to defensive battles that required the same tactical quality that had characterized their offensive operations, but in a context where tactical quality at the formation level could not compensate for the strategic exhaustion of the German war economy, and the overwhelming production advantage that the Soviet Union, now fully supplied by American Lend-Lease, was bringing to bear. The Western Front opened with the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944, and the Waffen SS formations committed encountered a different kind of opposition from what they had faced in the East. The tactical quality of the British, Canadian, and the American formations in Normandy was high. The material superiority was overwhelming, and the Allied air forces controlled the skies in a way that made daylight movement of armored formations extremely costly. The Das Reich division's march from its assembly area in southern France to the Normandy front took weeks rather than days because of constant Allied air attacks, and its operational impact was correspondingly reduced. The Das Reich march to Normandy also produced the worst single atrocity committed by a Waffen SS formation in Western Europe. On June 10, 1944, 4 days after the D-Day landings, soldiers of the Das Reich division entered the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane in the Haute-Vienne department and proceeded to kill its entire population. 642 men, women, and the children. The men were shot in barns. The women and the children were locked in the church and burned alive when the soldiers set the roof on fire. The village was then systematically looted and burned. The massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane was not a battlefield action. It was not a response to partisan activity in which the specific village had been involved. It was a reprisal against a civilian population conducted with a thoroughness and a methodology that reflected the institutional culture that the Waffen SS had developed in years of occupation duty and the anti-partisan operations in Eastern Europe, transplanted to Western Europe and applied to a French civilian population that had done nothing to provoke it. The village was never rebuilt. The ruins were preserved by the French government as a memorial. Every year, visitors walk through the burned-out buildings and read the names of the dead. The rusted frames of the bicycles and the sewing machines and the household objects that could not be burned are still there. The church where the women and the children died is still there. Its walls still standing, its interior still open to the sky. Oradour-sur-Glane is the most visible physical monument to what the Waffen SS was when it operated without any constraint, which was what it always did when given the opportunity. In the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 was the last major German offensive in which Waffen SS armored formations played a central role. The 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich and including the Leibstandarte, was the northern arm of the Ardennes offensive that Hitler had been planning since the autumn. The operation achieved initial surprise but rapidly encountered the specific combination of determined American resistance, difficult terrain, fuel shortages, and the Allied power that made the operational objectives impossible to achieve. The Leibstandarte battle group under Joachim Peiper, which had been given the most ambitious axis of advance of the entire Northern Thrust, fought its way to Staumont and Steflot before being cut off and forced to abandon its vehicles and withdraw on foot. The Battle of the Bulge also produced the Malmedy Massacre, in which soldiers of Piper's battle group shot approximately 84 American prisoners of war in a field near the town of Malmedy on December 17 ke-1944. The massacre was documented, its perpetrators identified, and after the war 73 members of the Leibstandarte were tried by an American military tribunal. 43 were sentenced to death. None of those death sentences were carried out. The convictions were reviewed, reduced, and eventually all of those convicted were released by 1956 through a combination of legal appeals, political pressure from German government officials, and the specific Cold War logic that made maintaining the goodwill of West German opinion more important to American policymakers than the execution of convicted war criminals. The post-war history of the Waffen-SS is a story of systematic rehabilitation that took decades to complete and that was achieved through a combination of organized advocacy by veterans organizations, the specific political needs of the Cold War, and the gradual erosion of public memory of what the formations had actually done. The HYG, the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members, was established in 1951 and operated openly in West Germany for decades, publishing a magazine, lobbying for veteran benefits, and actively promoting a narrative of the Waffen-SS as a straightforward military organization whose crimes were the work of individual perpetrators rather than institutional policy. The narrative HYG promoted was simple and persistent. The Waffen-SS was a frontline combat organization. Its members were soldiers like any other soldiers. The atrocities were committed by other SS components, the concentration camp guards, the Einsatzgruppen, the SD, not by the fighting soldiers of the Waffen-SS. The fighting soldiers fought honorably against overwhelming odds in defense of Europe against Bolshevism, and the post-war treatment, denial of veterans' benefits, refusal of pension rights, social stigma, was unjust. This narrative was false. The documented record shows beyond any reasonable dispute that Waffen-SS formations committed atrocities in every theater where they operated, that the institutional culture that produced those atrocities was not separate from the military culture of the formations but continuous with it, and that individual soldiers participated in both combat operations and war crimes without institutional distinction between the two kinds of activity. The personnel overlapped. The formations overlapped. The commanders who directed combat operations also directed reprisal operations. The same divisions that fought at Kursk and Kharkov also conducted massacres of prisoners and civilians. This is not a disputed historical claim. It is the conclusion of the documented record. The specific question of how military effectiveness and criminal atrocity could coexist in the same institution is one that military historians and psychologists have examined at length, and the answers that emerge from that examination are uncomfortable precisely because they do not require extraordinary evil or psychopathic personalities to explain. The institutional culture of the SS, with its emphasis on toughness, racial ideology, contempt for the designated enemies of the regime, and the specific dehumanization of everyone outside the SS Brotherhood, created conditions in which the commission of atrocities did not require an individual soldier to overcome his conscience in the way that the post-war rehabilitation narrative implied. The ideology had already done the work of defining the victims as not fully human. The atrocities followed from the ideology with the same logic that the tactical formations followed from the training. The decorated veterans of the Eastern Front and the perpetrators of village massacres were frequently the same people. This is the fact that the rehabilitation narrative could never fully accommodate and that makes the Waffen SS story genuinely different from the story of a military organization that committed isolated crimes. It was an organization whose criminal activity was structural rather than incidental, whose atrocities were expressions of its institutional character rather than departures from it. The last Waffen SS formation surrendered in the final days of the war in May 1945. Some fought to the end with a ferocity born partly of genuine fanaticism and partly of the specific terror of soldiers who knew what surrendering to the Soviets meant for men wearing the SS color insignia. The Soviets did not extend Geneva Convention protections to SS prisoners in all cases. And the fate of SS men captured on the Eastern Front in the final days was often summary execution. The death rate among SS prisoners of war held by the Soviet Union was significantly higher than among Wehrmacht prisoners, partly because the Soviets categorized them differently and partly because they had more reasons than most to view the distinction between a Waffen SS soldier and a concentration camp guard as to find to be worth observing. What remains of the Waffen SS in historical memory is contested in ways that should be familiar by now to anyone who has followed the broader argument about how to understand institutions that were simultaneously militarily capable and morally catastrophic. The graves of Waffen SS soldiers in German military cemeteries maintained by the German War Graves Commission are marked with the same grave markers as Wehrmacht soldiers. The legal determination that former Waffen SS members were entitled to the same veterans' benefits as former Wehrmacht soldiers, which came after decades of political struggle, created a formal equivalence that the historical record does not support. The 38 divisions that bore the SS insignia trained, fought, committed atrocities, and were ultimately destroyed in a military defeat of total comprehensiveness, ranging from the frozen approaches to Moscow in 1941 to the burning streets of Berlin in 1945. The million men who wore the double lightning rune served an ideology that was defeated and discredited by the totality of the military and the moral catastrophe that the regime they embodied brought upon Germany and upon Europe. The iron crosses are in museums now. The color patches are in archives. The divisional histories are on library shelves, written in many cases by the veterans themselves with the specific omissions and deframings that self-interested historiography always produces. And the ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane are still there, in the French countryside, where the burned bicycles, and the open church and the 642 names tell the part of the story that the divisional histories leave out. Military excellence is real. It can be measured and documented and assessed with professional precision. Criminal atrocity is also real. It can be measured and documented and assessed with moral precision. The Waffen SS possessed both simultaneously. And the fact that this is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind at the same time, the fact that the brain wants to resolve the contradiction rather than accept it, is the most important thing the Waffen SS story has to tell us. Not about the SS, about what human institutions are capable of being when the ideology that forms them removes the constraints that make atrocity unthinkable. The constraints matter. They are the only thing that matters. And the absence is the Waffen SS story from the first oath sworn to one man's name to the last bullet fired in the ruins of a country that oath had helped to destroy.